Pleased to introduce our next speaker before we go into some of our design work. It is Dr. Bob Russell from the National Science Foundation. He has his PhD in developmental psychology from Cornell and brings over 30 years of experience in STEM education to the National Center for Interactive Learning, spanning children's museums, science centers, community organizations, and media. Currently, Bob works full-time as a program director in the National Science Foundation's Directorate for Education and Human Resources, where he manages the review process and manages funded projects submitted through the Discovery Research K-12, Advancing Informal STEM Learning, Cyber Learning, and several other programs. He will be finishing up a 3-year appointment at NSF later this year. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Russell to the podium.
Well, thank you. Actually, you'll have me to kick around a little more. I'm going to be in NSF at least another 3 years, so I'll be talking to you about some opportunities at NSF. NSF, as you may know, is federal. It's one of those smaller. I mean, $7.5 billion a year agency. Which for me, I'm from Nebraska, and we don't have a lot of people, and we have lots of land, and $7.5 billion is an awful lot of money. But in any event, by federal standards, is small. But there are many opportunities, especially for projects like maker projects, to take advantage of the grant opportunities available at NSF. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you an overview of NSF as an agency. Some of you may be familiar with NSF, and I'm sure some of you are receiving or have already received funding, but then I'm surprised at how many people really aren't familiar with NSF as an agency, which funds a large proportion of the basic research at universities across the country. Well, National Science Foundation, the place where discoveries began, which is true, actually. Just a curious aside, one of thousands of examples. One of the founders of Google got graduate research support from NSF. There are hundreds or thousands of examples like that where basic research started with NSF, and it may have morphed into something much larger, but it had to start with understanding some fundamental problem in some area of science, and that's what NSF does. There's a slide of some kids having fun with some geometric shapes, but it just shows that a lot of, people have talked about how they have the best job. Well, I have one of the best jobs in the entire federal government. I get to talk about people about their exciting projects in making, informal education, engineering, all these areas, and I get to tell some people that they're not getting the money, but then I get to tell some people that you're getting $250,000 or you're getting $3 million, and it's not my unilateral decision. I play a role in the review process, but I can't complain. I really love my job. So, first of all, what is NSF? You probably all know that NSF started after World War II, in part, this came in part out of the fact that the United States developed atomic weapons and and a lot of other technology in World War II, and so there was great interest at that point in time, which was at the beginning of the Cold War, to make sure that we understood everything well enough so that we could develop the resources our nation needed for our defense, but also just to develop economically, and it's paid off big time. NSF spends about $1.3 billion out of its about $7.6 billion budget. I think that was as of fiscal year 14. So about, between, I guess it would be about 13 or 14% of the funding is devoted to education. About 3/4 of it is through the division I'm in, Education and Human Resources, EHR, nearly $1 billion. And the rest is through the other research directorates that, like engineering, there are engineering educations funded through engineering and in geosciences, et cetera. And this is how the funding breaks down. A lot of the funding, 45%, goes for supporting undergraduate and graduate students through fellowships, dissertation research grants, that kind of thing. And then the rest of the funding, a lot of that goes for informal education, classroom, iTest, which is a youth technology program, and basic research on science education. With regard to the age levels that the funding supports, 38% for graduate and postdoc, 36% for undergraduate. So what that means is that of that over $1 billion that's spent on education each year, the lion's share goes to universities. But for outreach and informal, multi-level, still a significant proportion of funding goes for those other areas. So what's in the NSF portfolio? Well, this is kind of the Education Directorate's mission statement, to support the development of a STEM workforce for tomorrow and to have an educated public that knows about science and can make intelligent decisions when they're voting and in other ways about science. This is by the numbers. I won't go through all the specific numbers, but the bottom line is there are, a rich variety of grants available through the Directorate of Education and Human Resources, and the funding rate just proportionately is anywhere from between 10 to 20%. And it's been getting more competitive in recent years. Unfortunately, like research grants and like NIH grants, the money has stayed, in many cases, has stayed relatively level, but the demands keep going up. And so researchers are becoming more and more like my age as opposed to some of the younger scientists and engineers out in the audience, and that's possibly unfortunate, but that's just the reality. But in any event, the funding is there, and if you have a good idea and you develop it in a good way, your chances of getting funding are pretty good. Well, that's just another way of slicing and dicing the funding in education. Education and training, about 2/3, basic research, about 1/3 of the $800+ million that goes through the division, or through the Directorate of Education and Human Resources. And so I could go through the specifics of this chart, but one thing is that in Education and Human Resources, there's been a strong shift towards funding foundational research to figure out, in a theory-based research way, how do people learn, in what environments do they learn most effectively, what approaches work most effectively, rather than just asking the practical question, well, I've got this idea and I want to try out this specific technique, and then just asking some commonsensical questions that aren't based in a research and theoretical framework. So there's been a shift towards, grounding the work in research and theory so that, there's more of a generalizable basis. So if you want to do something, you can turn to a body of knowledge that will inform how you design whatever it is you'd like to do. So these are some of the directions that NSF is moving in with respect to education. Consolidating and expanding the fundamental research, like I just pointed out. Trying to look at larger scale implementation so that we can study, how there's the whole issue of, what we call it, the fancy language is the research to practice continuum. But, maybe the easier analogy is in medicine, somebody comes up with a basic finding, and then, how do you translate that into a treatment? And it's not as simple as figuring out, well, I found this thing out about cancer, and then we can turn it into this pill. It's like, how do you get that into the healthcare system? And how do you get people to take their pills? And similarly, in educational research, you can figure out some approach that might work well in the classroom. So then you have to figure out, well, how do we get school systems to adopt it? And how do we professionally develop teachers to use it? And how do we get them to use it with some fidelity? So it's, there's a lot of steps in the process. All right. So now we're into the, making, which is really, you didn't want to hear all that other stuff. You wanted to hear about making. So how does NSF support making? Well, this is my own analysis. This is not official. President Obama hasn't approved this. But at any rate, one thing is to support technologies, the wide range of technologies that support making activities. So NSF has funded a lot of research in that area. Secondly, funding maker education, both in informal spaces like museums, libraries, and the community, as well as in formal spaces such as university classrooms and K through 12. Third, just talked about research, supporting, so what happens with maker, how do we link maker with STEM education? What kinds of impacts can it have, both educationally and then, on our economy with regard to developing some of these, using maker spaces to create economic opportunity. And finally, what does NSF supports, maybe this surprises you, but NSF supports marketing and entrepreneurial activities. So that's what I want to do, is to spend the rest of my few minutes trying to quickly walk through some examples there. Okay, so first, research support for 3D printing and custom manufacturing. Well, NSF, over about a 15-year period, invested about $200 million, and a lot of that research was fundamental to the development of 3D printers and some of the other technology. And this was this would have been hundreds of grants. Here's one specific example. This was an engineering SBIR grant. It gave grants early on to 2 firms, to help develop additive manufacturing, which is obviously foundational to 3D printing. And then secondly, another example that is fundamental to 3D printing is Helisys to commercialize the sheet lamination process. So NSF has funded a lot of grants like this that have provided the knowledge that was needed to develop technologies like these. Well, NSF has also provided funding for a lot of maker education. And of course, we all know that we call a lot of things maker education that we've had around. Like when I was a kid, I remember I wasn't successful. Makers have to learn from when they fail, and I was trying to develop a transportable stink bomb, by hydrogen sulfide and wax in a test tube, and if you heat it up, it creates hydrogen sulfide. And I was trying to capture that in a plastic balloon when I was like 8 or 9. I didn't understand that the acidic qualities of the gas aren't very good for the balloon. And my mother also didn't appreciate it that I did this right next to the washer dryer area. But anyway, museum, many children's museums have had art workshops where kids can create things, that kind of thing. And of course, if you grew up in the 50s like me, well, we all had tools and all kinds of things, and we'd build things and make things at that point. So there have been making activities forever. But now it's ramping up, and the technologies, as we all know, like 3D printers and electronics and et cetera, have formed the foundation of this new incarnation of making. And NSF has supported projects in that arena. So the Exploratorium has an area which, I don't know how many of you have visited the Exploratorium, but they have a tinkering studio, which is just another name for making of a sort. It's a little more structured than just here's a bunch of technology or materials you can work with, but kids can experiment in that area with a lot of different, biology, chemistry, electronics, to create something in there. So that's a very successful space. The second example is a maker space at a Massachusetts high school where kids have a whole variety of electronics tools and they can create a wide variety of things. And third is it's called From Problem to Product, and it's a project at the New York Hall of Science for middle and high school students. And their students create something, and they work with mentors, and they take it from the idea to developing it to trying to develop it into a marketable concept. So they not only have to figure out how to make the thing, but then they take it to they start thinking about marketing and entrepreneurial aspects of it. So when I was looking around for, kind of doing some background research, I thought this was a nice chart. Like, well, how has maker education come together? And this was an article that Jackie Gerstein, this was from an article Jackie Gerstein wrote in I believe it was in Education Week. And it just talks about these forces like information access, the do-it-yourself movement, electronics, open source resources, ability to work together online, and so on. All these things kind of came together, in the right way to help provide the foundation for maker education. And then, of course, there were some individuals who sort of saw all these things happening, and partly it was this, groundswell and then with some people like the people that started Maker Education, Make Magazine, et cetera, that helped people recognize that it was a movement, and that helped provide more focus on it. Anyway, the third thing NSF does is it supports research on the educational impact of making. So, for example, there's a project at the Exploratorium. The researcher is Daniel Schwartz from Stanford, and he's looking at, well, so if you spend some time in the tinkering lab at the Exploratorium, how can that contribute to future learning? So you don't try to measure what happened right that moment. You look at something later kids are trying to learn, and if kids had an experience in the tinkering lab, are they better at learning whatever it was than kids who didn't have that experience? That's one interesting example. Northwestern University, they're trying to look at the dialogue that parents and kids have, when they're engaged in making activity and how that can contribute to that activity. And then there's a Georgia Tech project, and they look at the incorporation of maker activities into upper-level engineering classes and to see how that improves knowledge transfer and just how well the students do. So there's a rich variety of research that NSF is supporting regarding making and its impact. And finally, NSF support of marketing and entrepreneurship. And I'm sure some people in the audience know a lot more about this than I do, but are there any people here involved in I-Corps? And can you just briefly, like, what's been your experience in I-Corps?
So I-Corps takes research from universities and takes researchers with an entrepreneurial lead and figures out if there is a market for your idea and how to bring it to market. And it's a pretty transformational experience with a good grant amount that is basically spent entirely on you trying to figure out how to market your research. It's great.
And you get some training along with that, right?
Yeah, fantastic training.
Right, some training and technical support in marketing and entrepreneurship. If you have an idea that looks like it can be turned into something that people will pay for. So that's one thing that NSF has supported. And so there's just a snapshot of, there's over 115 institutions in 45 states that have taken part in the I-Corps curriculum. And this mechanism actually operates across other federal agencies like NIH. So it's not exclusive to NSF. But that's, I'm sure the majority of people have heard of that already, but it's something worth checking out, either to take part, if you happen to have had a maker grant, a maker-focused grant, and you've developed something and you want to take it to market, you can get a lot of good support, peer support, mentoring support, and practical knowledge. And then I-Corps is, let's see, well, there's just a little bit more about I-Corps. Anyway, NSF provides other support for maker projects. Program that, probably the program I'm most involved with is called Advancing Informal STEM Learning. We used to call it Informal Science Education, but then we changed the name. It supports a wide range of projects, after school, museums, libraries, anything outside the classroom, and maker education is one of the kinds of projects that the program is investing a lot more in. So if you have a maker project idea, that's one program to check out. Another interesting one, I think, that focuses on K through 12, mostly middle and high school, is called iTest, Innovative Technologies for the Education of Teachers and Students. And it's an interesting program that many universities get involved in because you can recruit, you can have a project for students where they get some involvement in technology, and it can have a making focus. And then some of those students may end up coming to your university. So it's a nice way to recruit, and also a nice, and the program has an emphasis on underserved students, so it's a nice way to recruit students from underserved, underrepresented backgrounds as well. And it's also a great way to provide those students with some rich opportunities with engineering, biology, whatever the topic is, that they wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to have. There's the iUse program, so that you can use that to develop to infuse your engineering or whatever curriculum you have at your university. You can infuse making into that curriculum. And then another angle on that is we call it TWOS, but it's Teaching Undergraduate Education in Science. And finally, one thing I'd like to highlight is NSF has a mechanism called Dear Colleague Letters, and that's where NSF encourages grants focused on whatever the topic is. And there happens to be one out now on making, and there's a target date of December 17th this year, and there's another one December 15th next year. And the grant mechanism is called EAGER, and that's to fund kind of way out ideas, high risk, high gain. So it's not like you can just come up with any idea that pops in your head and write it down and send it in, but there has to be some reason to believe that there's some prospect that this idea is going to work out, but also recognizing it might not. So you can ask for up to $300K for a grant. Most of the grants are a year or two long. And so if you look this up, you'll find that there are several different contact people. So you'd reach out to the relevant contact person if you have an education project or you had an engineering project or what have you. And you'd talk to a program officer, and they could discuss your idea with you and help you figure out if it fit in with this particular initiative. And then if it did, and try to call right away because it's coming up. But if your idea did, then we'd really like to encourage you to submit a proposal. And it's not as while any NSF grant is complicated, but the grant narratives for a usual NSF proposal are 15 pages, but these are only typically like 5 or 6 pages. So it's not quite the burden of like a regular NSF grant. So I'd really encourage you all to check that out. So I guess my timing is about right. There's where to find me, so I'll leave that up there for a second, and I'll be here all afternoon. And I guess let me just say one other quick thing. You know, I'm a program officer, so I'm paid for by your tax dollars, as all program officers are. And I don't think any of you are afraid of calling a program officer and this mysterious federal agency, but I'm amazed at how many people are when I give outreach talks. And, you know, program officers are, you know, we're not there to, you know, to send you away or say, oh, your idea is terrible. You know, the program officers want to support the development of well-designed, effective projects. And if you talk to a program officer, they can be very helpful to you in that regard, figuring out where your idea might fit in with what grant program, and then giving you some very practical advice on how to shape your project so that it would have a greater chance of funding. So I'd really encourage you to contact NSF. Often a program officer may say, okay, that sounds interesting, can you send me like a 1 or 2 page summary of your idea, and then we'll have a you know, more in-depth conversation. But you know, and it's not that every single program officer is friendly, but 90% or more are. And so I'd really encourage you to, you know, NSF has got hundreds of different grant possibilities, you know, all over the map. And so I'd really encourage you to check out NSF, and then if you have trouble finding your way, call a program officer. And you know, I spend a lot of time just helping people navigate. So thank you.